Good morning. Well, it's morning for me right now while I'm doing this anyway. So, we're going to take a break from characterization because the question I keep getting is, how do you write a book? What inspires you? How do you finish a book? And I thought, probably there are a lot of people during this time who decided this is the moment. This is your moment to write that book you've been thinking about for a really long time. So, I'm going to talk to you today about how to write a book, but I'm going to preface it by saying this is a way to write a book, not the way to write a book, because anyone who tells you that they have the way to write a book means they have the way to write a book for themselves. We are creative people. Writing is a creative process, and no one can tell you what your process should be. But you can get insights into how to develop your own process by listening and learning about the process of others. So I'm going to talk to you today about my process, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the process of other authors that I have known throughout the years and the things that they do. I'm going to tell you, I don't know if Susan Wigg still writes books this way, but years ago we were chatting and she was talking about how she writes her entire first draft longhand in notebooks. Okay, like I couldn't do that. There is no way I could do that because I edit as I go. Every process I've ever developed to write includes an element of editing as I go. It could be my OCD, it could just be my process. It really doesn't matter to me because it works for me. But I love the fact that that's what she does. And let's say you're a really visceral person who likes that physical act of writing. That might be your process. It could be that your process is to write longhand all day long and then type it into the computer or drag and speak it into the computer. That could work for you. Okay, so that's one process. That's her process. Another author who I love, Julie Garwood. And I went to my very first RWA conference and she was giving a chat with Julie Garwood. And one of the questions that came up was, how do you write? What is your process? And at that time, like I said, I have no idea what her process is today because that was over 10 years ago. Probably over 15 years ago. Golly, it's been a while. Anyway, her process at that time was to actually use a typewriter. She would type her pages, and she had just started giving them to a word processor, someone who could type those pages into the computer. But prior to that, what she would do is write the whole book on the typewriter, then go back and edit the entire book on the typewriter. So she would retype and edit as she went. Now, how she does it now, I have no idea, but that's how she did it. And I'm telling you this because these are different ways to write a book. Now, let's talk a little bit about how I write a book. Oh, I'll tell you one more process before we get to mine because I loved the way she did this. Meg Chittenden, who wrote romantic suspense before she moved into cozy mysteries, she wrote, what she would do is she would research. And she kept these boxes, she called them wine boxes. I don't know, I guess boxed wine came in these crate type things. And she would just throw everything because like me, she was a visceral person. She liked that paper. I'll print a lot of my research off even if I find it online because I like to have something that I can pick up and read away from the screen. So she would fill that. And when the box was full, she'd start writing her book because she had everything she needed. She had all of the ideas. She had all of the knowledge that she needed to start the book. I'm not saying she didn't have to keep researching after a particular plot point or whatever, but she had what she needed. So that was her process. It was a very organic, she used to laugh because she'd say, I'm in the middle of a book because there'd be stacks and stacks and mess around my desk. Well, if you see, this is my library, but it's also where I've been working for the last couple of months. I don't like stacks. I can't stand mess around me. I can't work in a messy environment. My house has to be clean. I have to be clean. My library has to be clean before I can write. That's my process. You don't have to share it. You can be a stacker, but you also, if you're not a stacker, doesn't mean you're not a writer. I've published over 70 books. Wish I could tell you the exact number, but I I did the count at 70, then I've published some since then. I don't know how many it is. Could be 75, could be 76. I don't know. But anyway, I don't think we're quite at 80 yet. So the point I'm making is that I'm a writer. I am an author, and I don't like to stack, and I don't like mess, and I can't stand a messy office. And that's me, and that doesn't have to be you, okay? So I'm going to tell you about my process before and then my process after. And the before and after isn't even before I sold my first book, but it's before I wrote my first book by the seat of my pants. So I was a plotter, and I plotted all of my books out for almost 9 years. And by the way, before you say, oh, those books probably weren't as good as the ones that she did after, I sold every one of those books after I sold my first book, which was actually the 13th book I'd written. But my point is that I learned a lot through plotting. And sometimes when I'm stuck, I'll go back and revisit some aspect of this writing process in order to get me through to the next point in my book, okay? So when I was a plotter, and so this is for those of you who want to like have some kind of structure to your story, I did use what are called plot cards, because at no point in my writing process have I ever been a completely linear writer, or have I ever been someone who just followed an outline. I can't do that. It's just not how I write fiction. So I write plot cards, and on my plot card, I had the top would be like the title of the scene. Then I would say whose point of view I thought the scene was going to be in, because basically you want it in the point of view with the person who has the most emotional, if you're writing romance, gain or to lose, right? The most emotional turmoil. If you're writing mystery, it's the person who has the most to gain or lose with the plot, right? With the mystery plot. So you're in that point of view. That's, people don't pop into the head of their villains for no reason. There's a reason for being in the head of a villain. It's because whatever that scene is, whatever that moment is, it's a moment where the villain has something to gain or to lose. And you may not immediately recognize what that is when you're reading it. But as the writer, I sure hope you know what it is when you've written it. I don't analyze my work as I'm writing, but when I go back, if a scene doesn't have, okay, this is where my OCD comes in, but it doesn't have 3 reasons for being there, that scene doesn't belong in my book. Okay, but that's part of editing, and we'll get to that in a minute. So on a plot card, I would write down then jots about the scene. Some plot cards got I started using those 5x7 ones or 4x6 ones. They fit in a 4x6 photo album. And that was a great way to store them, because then you could just move them around. If you're going to move a scene to a different place in the book, you just pick that plot card and move it, right? And on that plot card, I have a picture in my head of one plot card. I used to color code them. So go with me here, but pink was if it was in the heroine's point of view, blue was if it was in the hero's point of view, green if it was in someone else's point of view, and or I wasn't sure, okay? And so I had this, I can picture this one card. I had tiny writing all over the front, all over the back for this scene that I was like 10 scenes from writing. So for my first book that got published, but I was still using plot cards, this was the Greek Tycoon's Ultimatum. And I just wanted to kind of show you, if you can see that, this is one of the plot cards. And you'll notice I used Post-it notes to add when I didn't have any space on the card itself, or if I just wanted to add a little note. I was still using just white with the Greek Tycoon's Ultimatum. Some books I did that. Some books I wrote with different colors of ink. And some books I use different colors of cards. And that was one way to keep my creative process in check, sort of, you know, like, so I could keep writing the book, but I knew this scene was coming, and I wouldn't lose that really great idea I had in the middle of the night about that scene. So plot cards are really useful to me. Now, I know authors who use outlines. I know authors who don't use plot cards or outlines, but are still plotters. They just have a different way of putting their plot down before they start. Like they'll just write a really long synopsis or a really short synopsis or whatever, okay? what I would then do is I would start writing the scene. And then as I finished, I got one of those flip photo albums. I would just flip that scene. It was done. Then I was on to my next scene. And it really helped because I knew where I was going. And what I would try to do when I was writing a book was for a short contemporary, which is about 50,000 words, give or take 5,000, whatever, I would try to have 12 to 13 scenes conceptualized in my plot cards, along with those, like one of those scenes was going to be the dark moment, your climax of the book, and then your resolution scene, right? And if you have particular ideas for the epilogue, that needs to be on a card that says epilogue, and then whatever those ideas are. So when I'm writing a book that is a single title, which is somewhere between 80 and 100,000 words for me, I used to do, I don't know if you can see them, but about 20 scenes, maybe more, that I would plot out in advance. So those plot cards were neat, and I wrote several books using the plot cards that way. And then I suddenly realized, I don't remember how many books in to my writing process I was, when I realized that I was deviating from my plot cards by chapter 3 and completely going off in a different direction. You wouldn't recognize it from the plot cards I had in that flip book. So it took me a couple more books because I don't take change well sometimes. I can take a while to change my process, to change anything. And so it took me a while to realize what I was doing and to say, wait a minute, maybe this isn't the best way for me to write anymore. But for a long time, it worked really well. So I can highly recommend plot cards. I think they can be very, very efficient and very helpful. But what I moved to from plot cards, I didn't go directly into writing by the seat of my pants yet. What I did was I started doing more character interview sheets and setting. I would decide where my settings were, and I would do visual inspiration boards for my setting, for my characters. I would do the interview for my characters would be things about their socioeconomic background, about their thoughts, their feelings, who they were, what they wanted. I remember taking the Goal, Motivation, and Conflict by workshop by Deb Dixon, thinking it was really useful, but it only worked so far for me. And just recently, Joanne Grant, and I'm going to give a shout out to her. She's a editorial coach now, or an author coach, former editor. She is amazing, and she put it in, because I used to say there were that conflict was layers. You had layers, and that you built on layers. And she said it was like this ebb and flow, waves of conflict. And that kind of makes more sense. For me, GMC didn't work because it stuck with this big central conflict. But sometimes in a book, that big central, and a lot of times for me, I'm not saying for everyone, but for me, that central conflict morphs. And it can go this way or it can go this way. It's the waves of conflict. It adds on. I don't want to get bored. I don't want the reader to get bored. It's not the same conflict from page 1 on page 120. For me, right? Let's always remember that we're talking about what works for you, not for someone else. Okay, so eventually I moved into writing by the seat of my pants. However, I will give a caveat to that. I still do inspiration sheets, character sheets, with visual inspiration for my hero and my heroine and any major secondary characters. I still do inspiration sheets for the kinds of clothes that both of them wear. I will still do inspiration sheets sometimes for my setting, although I've gotten away from that, but I'd like to get back to it because I find it helpful. So I have these things. I have the list. I have names. I have ages. I have my physical character types. I have personality types. I have like my little things written down. My plot is a story idea that is probably 1 to 2 paragraphs I have either sent off to my editor or not sent off to my editor and just written. And I don't do the plot cards anymore. I don't try to figure out what scenes are going to come next because for me it's become a very organic process. And to be really honest, I oftentimes will wake up with having dreamt one of the scenes that I need to write next. So my subconscious is very much a part of my writing process now. It always was, but now I just allow it to have that kind of guidance, and I don't try to stick with with the plot. I don't try to stick with that plot point or with a scene I thought was going to be in the book. I have written scenes that don't end up in the book because for me they define the characters and they help me get into the story, but then it doesn't end up fitting in the book, and that's okay. It's I think one of the hardest things you learn, but one of the most important things you learn as an author is to let go of your writing. It's to acknowledge when, no matter how well written a scene or a moment is, or that particular line, and I'm sure you've heard this 100 times, because I certainly did when I started doing any kind of workshops and stuff. It was a constant, like that was the message. Don't be afraid to cut your own work. Well, don't. I mean, I remember Julie Garwood saying she'd cut 7,000 words out of one of my favorite books, and she's like, if I can cut, you can cut. And I was like, yeah. I mean, like seriously, sometimes you just have to cut it because it doesn't work in the book. But I will say I don't cut very much. It isn't very often that I have a scene that ends up getting tossed. And it might be because of the way that my brain works. It might be because of the way that my creative brain works. I don't know. It could, whatever. I don't do a lot of cutting, but I do cut when I need to. And when a scene doesn't work in the book, I don't put it in. And like I said, I said a little bit earlier, if a scene doesn't have 3 reasons for being there, then chances are it's not going to stay unless it has a super compelling reason for being there. So, there are no rules in writing. Or if there are rules, then you certainly need to know how to break them and when to do so. Don't be afraid to learn. When I wrote my first book, I did not know what dialogue tags were. I was still saying, said she, said he, which was a big thing in the 70s, which were the books that I had read a lot as a young child because they were a quarter at the used bookstore, right? A young child, young woman, whatever. Yeah, I did start reading Harlequins at the age of 13. I snuck them out of my sister's drawer. But my point is that language changes over time. Written language changes over time. Make sure you're writing with the language that works for today. If you're going to write by the seat of your pants, just remember, there are a couple of things you need to do. You need to know your characters. If that means writing the whole book first and then going back and rewriting the book, that's fine. I don't really care what your process is. I remember hearing Susan Elizabeth Phillips talking about writing, and she writes by the seat of her pants. She doesn't prep plots, right? And she's talked about, she said she has written herself into a corner more than once where she had to go back and basically trash chapters and chapters of her work. If that's how you write, do it. Her books are amazing, right? So cool. But you're not going to seat of the pants right and get it perfect the first time if you don't know your characters and you don't have some concept of where they're going. So it's not a matter of, you either or writing, plotting, or pantsing. It's what works for you and then finding what part of that works for you. So like I said, I do some prep work, not plotting anymore. I don't plot, but I know the concept, my story concept, and I know my characters when I start. If I don't know my characters, what I will do is rewrite the first 3 chapters, probably 3, 4, sometimes 5 or 6 times. Just go back and rewrite, because from that point on, I am then good to go. I know my characters, I know my setting, I know my story, I have my solid foundation, and I'm off. That's how I write by the seat of my pants. It is not necessarily how you do. I just mentored a young woman who wrote the entire story. Then she rewrote it, and it ended up being like 4 times longer, because when she wrote the first time, that was a seat of the pants, getting the concept down, getting the characters down, and then she fleshed out the story. That's all right. However you want to do it. Just remember that as you're writing, your words matter, my words matter. So make your words good ones.